Beg me to stop, and I won't." The cowboy whispered it to the shaking saloon girl right at midnight, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. Red Horse Crossing was a town that didn't forgive softness. It was a place carved out of dust and desperation, where smoke, whiskey, and sin were the only weather that mattered. And tonight, a storm had just walked through the saloon doors. His name was Boone McGraw, and he carried trouble like a second holster, strapped low and ready. Clara, in her scarlet velvet dress, felt the whole room tilt on its axis when his shadow finally fell across hers. Her smile was painted on, steady as a rock, but her hands were shaking inside the folds of her skirt. His whisper hit her like the cocking of a revolver. "Beg me to stop, and I won't." She looked at the hard lines of his face, a map of wars she couldn't name, and she had no idea if he was offering her ruin or salvation. Or maybe, just maybe, they were the same damn thing. The Chisholm Trail was a scar across the land, a river of dust and bone, and every town it touched, like Red Horse Crossing, ended up smelling of sweat, blood, and whiskey that was cheap enough to burn a hole through a man's soul. The saloon was the town's beating heart, its walls made of pine that still bled sticky sap whenever the lamps burned too hot for too long. The floorboards groaned under the weight of 1,000 sins, each one heavier than the last, and the air was so thick with tobacco smoke it looked like ghosts were tangled up in the rafters, refusing to move on. A piano in the corner was being punished, not played, its tune lost under the roar of drunken laughter. In the back, a card game was making promises of fortunes that would be gone by sunrise, vanished like a dream. Clara May stood on the edge of all that chaos. Her back was as straight as a fence post, her smile a slash of red paint. But behind the curtain of her velvet skirt, her hands trembled. The scarlet velvet wasn't her choice. It was the madam's. Said it made her look dangerous. Clara was anything but. Danger was in the eyes of the men who lurched toward her, their fists clutching coins that were still warm from some other poor soul's pocket. She'd learned the hard way to keep her voice soft, her laugh hollow, her every movement a careful calculation. This saloon girl costume was a set of chains, bright enough to catch the light, but heavy enough to drown her. She'd tilt her head, pretending to listen to some cattle drover's long-winded story, but her mind was 1,000 miles away. It was back in Missouri, listening to the sweet sound of her father's fiddle, humming the hymns they sang in church on Sundays. That was before the war came and stole everything that mattered. Every single night, she'd whisper a promise to herself. This isn't forever. She'd imagine slipping out under the cover of a moonless sky, riding until the endless prairie swallowed this whole town, leaving nothing but a bad memory. But every single morning she woke up, and she was still wearing that scarlet velvet. Trapped. Tonight was different. The saloon doors swung open so hard they slammed against the walls, and a gust of wind pushed its way inside, carrying the dust of the trail with it. The whole room shifted, the noise dipping for just a second. He walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shadow that clung to him like a second skin. His hat was pulled down low, hiding his eyes, and his boots hit the floor with the heavy, certain sound of a man who belonged to no one and nowhere. Trouble didn't just follow him. It poured off him like smoke. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She'd seen her share of killers and cowards, gamblers and drifters, but there was something in the way this stranger moved that set him apart. He wasn't here for a drink. He wasn't here to lose his money at cards. He was here for something else entirely. Clara's painted smile stayed put, but a cold knot of fear tightened under her corset. It was a strange feeling, like her heart already knew what was coming. The story of her life, the one she hated so much, had just taken a turn, and she had a terrible feeling she was no longer the one holding the reins. The lamps were burning low, their wicks sputtering in the last of the oil. The night was bleeding out, and the last few stragglers in the saloon clung to their whiskey glasses like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. The piano had finally gone silent. The drunk who'd been pounding on it had passed out in the corner, his greasy fingerprints smudging the ivory keys. Clara stood by the silent instrument, her fingers ghosting over the keys. For a second, she imagined she could coax a hymn out of it, something clean and pure that could wash the filth of this place away. But it was a fool's dream. Her scarlet velvet dress drank the lamplight, making her look like a pretty ornament, polished and placed here for men to look at, but never, ever understand. She felt him before she saw him. It was a sudden heat at her back, a heavy silence that rolled off him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Boone McGraw. The name had been a whisper passed through the crowd earlier, a name spoken with a mix of awe and fear. He didn't stumble like the other men. He didn't leer or laugh that hollow, booming laugh. He moved with the solid weight of a man who believed every room belonged to him the second he stepped into it. He moved closer, so close the brim of his hat brushed against her shoulder. Clara's breath caught, a tiny sharp sound in the quiet room, but she didn't move an inch. She'd learned a long, long time ago that showing fear was like bleeding in a river full of sharks. It only made them bolder. His voice came out of the dark, low and steady. It was the sound of a revolver being cocked. "Beg me to stop, and I won't." The words didn't just hit her ears. They sank into her skin, sharp and soft all at once. They rooted her to the spot. A part of her wanted to laugh in his face, to shove him away, to prove she wasn't like the other girls who melted at the first hint of a dangerous promise. But her heart was a traitor. It started hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that was louder than the shuffling boots outside, louder than the clink of a bottle being set down at the bar. His breath, warm and smelling of the trail, stirred the curls at her temple. She could smell the whole wide prairie on him, leather, gun oil, sweat, and endless dust. It was like he carried the Great Plains inside his coat. He wasn't asking for her permission. He was giving her a warning. He was daring her. He was binding her with words that felt like both a threat and a sacred vow. Clara let her eyes flutter shut for half a second, just long enough to feel the tremor that ran through her hands. Ruin or salvation. She didn't know which one he was offering. She didn't know if she wanted to run for her life or lean back into the heat of him. All she knew was that something in this man promised to destroy her, and something else promised to save her. And standing there, with his shadow covering her, she had no way of telling which one would claim her first. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that one of them would. Morning light in Red Horse Crossing showed no mercy. It was a harsh, unforgiving glare that stripped away the soft lies of the night. It revealed the slick mud in the streets where gamblers had dreamed of gold, and it lit up the hollow, haunted eyes of men who had drunk themselves brave only to wake up broken. Clara May stepped onto the boardwalk, and the hem of her scarlet dress immediately began to gather the morning's dust. The rouge on her lips felt faded and cheap in the sunlight. The lamps in the saloon knew how to hide things, how to make things beautiful. The sun only knew how to tell the truth. And the truth was, she was tired. A deep, soul-level tired that no amount of sleep could ever fix. The town's gossip started early, like roosters crowing at the dawn. Tongues were wagging, hungry for a new story to chew on, and his name was the main course. She heard it carried on the wind in broken pieces. Boone McGraw. Spoken with a shiver of fear, but also a spark of awe. Boone McGraw, the gunfighter, the killer. He was the kind of man mothers warned their sons about becoming, and their daughters about meeting. The kind of man who walked into a town with the dust of Abilene still on his boots, and the shadow of death clinging to his shoulders. The stories were wild. Some said he'd shot a sheriff clean through the heart over a crooked card game. Others swore he'd taken down 3 card sharps at once without breaking a sweat. A few whispered something darker. They said Boone wasn't running from the law. He was running from himself, and that was a chase no man ever won. Clara tried to brush the whispers away like they were nothing but flies, but they stuck to her. She'd been around enough men to know that even the wildest rumors were built on a kernel of truth. Boone McGraw was dangerous. There was no way around that. And yet, when she saw him across the muddy street, her breath caught in her throat. He was standing with one boot propped up on a hitching post, the brim of his hat shading his eyes from the morning glare. And this is where it got strange. He wasn't looking at the bank, planning a score. He wasn't looking at the sheriff's office, sizing up the law. He wasn't even looking down the trail, planning his escape. He was looking at her. The whole world seemed to go quiet. The braying of a tired mule, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer, the rattle of a passing wagon. It all faded away until the only thing she could hear was the frantic drumming of her own pulse. Boone didn't smile. He didn't tip his hat like the other men did when they were trying to test her kindness, trying to see if she was an easy mark. He just watched her. His gaze was as steady and unshakable as the horizon, and something in that look, something quiet and intense, told her a terrifying truth. She wasn't just another painted girl he was planning to pass the time with. She wasn't a distraction. She turned away first, her heart pounding, forcing her legs to carry her back into the dim, stale air of the saloon. But the damage was already done. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever in this town, Clara felt seen. Not as the girl in the scarlet velvet dress, not as the saloon's property, but as herself. She told herself to be afraid. She told herself to be wary. But it was too late. She knew with a sinking feeling that was part terror and part thrill that Boone McGraw had just found a reason to stay in Red Horse Crossing. And God help her, she was it. She didn't just see him watching her from across the street. As she turned to go back inside, she saw two other men standing in the shadows of the livery. They weren't looking at Boone, they were looking at her. They were dressed like simple drifters, but their eyes were cold and sharp, and they held themselves with a stillness that wasn't natural. They weren't just passing through, they were waiting. A shiver traced its way down her spine. The fear wasn't just about Boone anymore. It was bigger. It felt like she had just walked onto a stage, and the play had started without her, but she was somehow the main character. Later that afternoon, while she was polishing glasses behind the bar, one of those men from the livery walked in. He didn't order a whiskey. He ordered a water and sat at a table in the corner, a table that gave him a clear view of the whole room, including the stairs that led up to her rented room. He just sat there, nursing his water, his eyes missing nothing. He was watching her, waiting for Boone to show up. Clara's hands started to shake again, and this time she couldn't hide them. She dropped a glass, and it shattered on the floorboards, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The man in the corner didn't even flinch. His eyes just flicked down to the broken glass, and then back up to her face. A tiny, cold smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a smile of satisfaction, like he had just confirmed something he already suspected, that she was the weak point. She was the bait in a trap she didn't even understand. That night, the fight exploded out of nowhere. It spilled into the saloon like whiskey from a bottle that had been smashed against the bar. It was loud, ugly, and it felt completely inevitable, like a storm that had been brewing all day. Clara had seen men try to tear each other apart over a woman or a card game more times than she could count. But this was different. The moment she saw Boone locked in a brutal struggle with the man from the livery, the man who had been watching her all day, her heart seized up in her chest. A knife glinted in the dim lamplight, a sliver of hungry steel. Steel flashed, fists flew, a table crashed to the floor. And when the chaos finally settled, Boone was the one left standing. But blood was seeping through his shirt, a dark, heavy stain that was spreading with terrifying speed. He swayed on his feet, once, twice, then caught himself on the bar rail with a sharp grunt. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a sound of pure defiance. The saloon was silent. No one moved to help him. Men like Boone McGraw carried their own burdens, and most folks were smart enough to know that you don't stand too close to a wounded wolf. But Clara couldn't look away. Something inside of her, something older and stronger than the velvet dress, older than the painted-on smile, made her feet move. Before anyone could stop her, before she could even think about what she was doing, she had her arm around his waist. She was half guiding, half dragging him toward the narrow, rickety stairs that led to the small room she rented above the saloon. Behind the locked door of her room, the world went quiet. The distant noise of the saloon, the shuffling of cards, the low murmur of voices, it all faded away until it was muffled, like a half-forgotten memory. Boone collapsed onto the edge of her small bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Sweat and dust and blood soaked into her sheets. Clara's hands were trembling as she lit the lamp, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the strange, terrifying intimacy of the moment. She set to work with a basin of water and a clean rag. His shirt came away in tatters, revealing a chest that was a roadmap of violence. Scars crisscrossed his skin, some thin and white with age, others jagged and cruel and still angry-looking. Each one was a story she didn't ask to hear, but her fingers read them all the same. She found what she was looking for just below his collarbone. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand, an intricate design of a hawk with a broken wing. Clara froze. The rag, dripping with bloody water, fell from her hand and hit the floorboards with a soft splash. She knew that mark. She reached up with a shaking hand and pulled a small silver locket from beneath the collar of her dress. It was the only thing she had left of her father. She snapped it open. Inside, on one side, was a tiny faded portrait of her mother. On the other, etched into the silver, was a family crest, a hawk with a broken wing. Boone saw the locket. He saw the recognition, the horror, dawn in her eyes. His own eyes, sharp and intense even through the haze of pain, widened in disbelief. "Ain't pretty, I know," he rasped, his voice heavy with exhaustion, nodding toward his scars. But Clara wasn't looking at the scars anymore. She was looking at the brand. She was looking at the man who wore the mark of the people who had destroyed her family, burned their home to the ground, and sent her running for her life. The man who wore the mark of Silas Kane. "What about you, Clara?" he whispered, his voice catching on her name. "You wear that velvet-like armor, but that ain't who you are." Her own secrets, the ones she had buried so deep she could almost pretend they weren't there, were clawing their way up her throat. And in that dim, suffocating room, she let one of them slip out, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to sing hymns in a church back in Missouri," she said, her eyes locked on the brand on his chest. "I thought my voice might carry me somewhere good. Then Silas Kane's men came, then the hunger came, and this velvet dress was the only stage I had left." Boone studied her, and the look in his eyes wasn't reverence anymore. It was a dawning, sickening understanding. "Guess we both got scars the world can't see," he finally said, his voice raw. For the first time since he walked into her life, Clara didn't believe him, because in that moment, in that locked room, their wounds didn't feel like a tether binding two broken souls together. They felt like a battle line being drawn. The nights that followed were heavier than a tombstone. They were thick with words that were too fragile, too dangerous to be spoken in the daylight. Boone stayed in Clara's upstairs room, his body healing slowly, his presence a constant, suffocating weight. He would talk for hours, his voice low and measured, and she would listen, her own voice trembling but true when she finally spoke. They were trading pieces of themselves in hushed whispers, each confession a coin slipped across a table in a game where the stakes were impossibly high. Boone told her about Abilene. He told her about the blood on his hands, about the debts that chased him like a pack of starving wolves. He told her about riding for Silas Kane, about being his right-hand man, his enforcer. He painted a picture of a man who was ruthless, ambitious, and utterly without mercy. a man who collected land like other men collected stamps and who crushed anyone who stood in his way. Clara, in turn, told him more about Missouri. She told him about the way the church pews smelled of pine and old hymnals, about the way the songs they sang on Sunday mornings seemed to rise up and lift the roof right off the building. She told him about the night Cain's men came, about the smell of smoke and the screams that followed. She told him about the gnawing, endless hunger that had stolen her voice from God and given it to gamblers and drifters. What was growing between them wasn't the clumsy, desperate grasp of lust she had endured 1,000 times before. It wasn't the hollow, pretty promises of men who bought an hour of her time for $1. It was something quieter and much, much deeper. It was a storm building in the silence, a storm that threatened to split her chest wide open. Boone never pushed, though she could see the hunger in his eyes. He only moved closer when she let him, his presence as heavy and steady as a mountain against the constant trembling in her bones. "You ain't safe here," he told her one night. His hand hovered just an inch above hers on the thin coverlet. It was a visible struggle, a man fighting his own instincts. "I can keep you from the local wolves, but you got to understand, Clara. The wolf I ran from, he don't like to be cheated. He'll circle me until the day I drop." Clara's heart stuttered in her chest. She had heard the rumors about men Boone had crossed, about blood feuds that didn't fade with time or distance. But hearing it from him, hearing the name Silas Cain spoken in this small room, made it real. She could almost imagine them out there in the darkness, shadows crouched just beyond the lamplight, waiting for the moment he showed a single sign of weakness. If she tied her life to his, she wouldn't just be hunted. She'd be the bait. Still, when he finally closed that last inch of space and his calloused fingers touched her hand, she didn't pull away. "Maybe I don't want to be safe," she whispered. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "Maybe I just want something real." His gaze locked on hers, dark and unyielding. "Real comes with a cost, Clara May. My kind of salvation. It don't come for free." Her breath trembled as it left her lips, a shaky, uncertain thing. But she didn't back down. For the first time since that scarlet velvet dress had become her skin, she felt something that was stronger than fear. It was a dangerous, reckless flicker of hope. And though she knew with every fiber of her being that ruin might be riding right alongside him, she also knew that she was already standing on the edge of a cliff. The only choice left was whether she was going to fall into his arms or fall back into the hollow, empty life she'd been living all along. The knock on the saloon door came just as the sun was setting, painting the dusty street in shades of blood and rust. It was a sharp, impatient sound, followed by the slow, deliberate creak of spurs on the wooden floorboards. Sheriff Dooling. He wasn't a man who wasted words or time. When he stepped into the lamplight, the entire saloon seemed to hold its breath. The room hushed the way it always does just before a storm breaks. He was tall and lean, his badge so dull from years of dust and disappointment it barely caught the light. His eyes were like chips of cold granite. They cut right past the card tables, past the nervous barkeep, and landed square on Boone McGraw, who was sitting at a table by the stairs. "Step outside," the sheriff said. It wasn't a request. Boone followed him without a word of protest, his shoulders squared like a man who had been expecting this summons all along. Clara watched from the top of the stair rail, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained to hear their voices through the open saloon doors. Dooling's tone carried on the evening air like a cold wind. "You can't stay here, McGraw. Not with your history. Not with the kind of men who are shadowing your every move. Every day you linger in this town is another day you pull it 1 inch closer to its own ruin. You'll draw them here like buzzards to a corpse." He paused, and his next words were a blade aimed right at Boone's heart. "And when they come, That girl upstairs. She'll be the first one they crush, just to get to you." Boone didn't answer right away. His silence was a weapon in itself, the kind that could unnerve even the most steadfast lawman. Finally, his voice came, low and flat and devoid of all emotion. "Then I'll ride out at dawn." The sheriff gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a nod of agreement. It was the nod of a judge sealing a verdict. He turned and left without another word. But Clara saw something else. Just before the sheriff turned, she saw him make a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand to someone standing in the shadows across the street. A signal. A sick feeling coiled in her stomach. The sheriff wasn't trying to save the town. He wasn't trying to save her. He was setting a trap. Boone stood in the street for a moment longer, his figure a dark silhouette against the last of the dying light. Then he climbed the stairs back to Clara's room. She was waiting for him, her face pale in the lamplight, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress into knots. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell her what they both already knew had to happen. But she moved first. She closed the space between them in 2 quick steps and pressed her forehead against his chest. Her arms wrapped around him with a desperate strength that seemed to steal the very breath from his lungs. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "Not yet. Not tonight." All the strength, all the hardness, seemed to drain out of him like water from a cracked canteen. For the first time in more years than he could remember, he wanted to lay his burden down. He cupped her face in his hands, his rough, calloused thumbs trembling against her soft skin. And in her eyes, he saw something he thought he'd lost for good. Hope. He should have left. God knows he meant to. He knew the sheriff was lying. He knew this was a trap. But as she clung to him with the stubborn force of a drowning soul, Boone McGraw, the man who had spent his entire life running from towns, from lawmen, from himself, discovered that he no longer wanted to run. For the first time, he wanted to stay. And that was the most dangerous choice he had ever made. It started with the sound of the saloon doors being kicked open, slamming against the walls with a crack like thunder. A gust of night air, cold and sharp, rushed in, carrying the scent of trail dust, nervous horses, and gun oil. The piano froze mid-note. Cards paused in mid-air. Then came the first shot. It was sharp and merciless, and it shattered a whiskey bottle on the top shelf of the bar into a glittering spray of glass and amber liquid. The room erupted into pure chaos. Men who had been bragging about their bravery moments before were now diving under tables. Women screamed, their cries sharp and piercing. Chairs toppled over with a clatter of splintering wood. Clara's blood turned to ice in her veins as she saw the shapes filling the doorway. They weren't just drifters or a drunken posse. They were outlaws, their faces as hard and unforgiving as stone, their eyes hungry. And they were all looking for one man, Boone McGraw. He was already moving. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He drew his iron with the blinding speed of a rattlesnake striking from the dust. His revolver barked, spitting fire into the dim, smoky light of the saloon. The air instantly filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the sound of screams. Clara's legs moved without any thought, carrying her barefoot across the sticky, beer-soaked floor. She dove beneath the small stage where the piano sat, and the shadows wrapped around her like a shroud. From that dark, hollow space, she watched the world above her splinter and break apart. Boone fought like a cornered animal, like a man who knew the grave was waiting for him, but was determined to make it wait a little longer. His hat was gone, his dark hair was damp with sweat, and his teeth were bared in a snarl that was equal parts pure fury and raw survival. Every shot he fired seemed to push death back one more step. Every move he made was a desperate, calculated shield between Clara and the men who had come to claim him. The brutality of it all made her shake uncontrollably, the sickening crack of a man's skull against a tabletop. the dull, heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. But there was another truth, a truth that unsettled her more than the violence. She could see it in his eyes, in the desperate way he kept glancing toward the stage where she was hiding. He wasn't fighting for gold. He wasn't fighting for his pride. He wasn't even fighting for his own life. He was fighting for hers. Glass from the shattered windows rained down, mixing with the stinging black powder that hung in the air. Clara pressed her palms against her ears, trying to block out the sounds, but it was useless. The curses, the cries of pain, Boone's own ragged breath as he reloaded with hands that were slick with blood, it all found its way in. She saw him stumble once, a bullet grazing his side, but he just surged forward again, moving like some wild creature that was wounded, but still unbroken. Her heart pounded in a frantic rhythm that matched each gunshot, each swing of his fist, each savage, stubborn refusal to fall. And in that dizzying haze of smoke and ruin, Clara finally understood something. It was a realization that terrified her more than any of the bullets flying through the air. Boone McGraw was laying his life down, piece by painful piece, buying her safety with every last beat of his own heart. And she knew, with a certainty that felt like a brand on her soul, that whether he survived this night or not, she would never be free of him again. The debt would be too great. The saloon was a wreck. When the smoke finally started to clear, it revealed a scene of pure destruction. The windows were shot out, leaving jagged teeth of glass in their frames. The floor was a treacherous landscape of brass casings, broken bottles, and the dark, sticky pools of something she refused to name. Outside, the night still trembled with the echo of the last gunshot. But inside, the entire world had narrowed to the sound of Boone McGraw's staggering, painful steps up the staircase. Clara had her arm hooked under his shoulder, her small frame straining under his weight. She was half dragging, half guiding him toward the relative safety of her room. Every pained groan that escaped his lips felt like a knife twisting in her own gut. When the door finally shut behind them, the click of the lock sounded impossibly loud. Clara lit the lamp, her fingers shaking so badly it took her 3 tries. Then she turned to face him. Boone collapsed onto her bed, his shirt more red than white, his chest heaving like a blacksmith's bellows. For a long moment, she just stood there, frozen, her body rigid with a panic so intense it felt like she couldn't breathe. Then something inside of her shifted. Her fear, which had been as sharp as a shard of glass, dulled. It was replaced by a kind of fierce, cold clarity. She wasn't a saloon girl anymore. She wasn't a victim. She was the only thing standing between this man and death. She fetched water. She tore clean strips from her own petticoat without a second thought. She knelt at his side. The wounds were ugly, carved deep into his flesh by both knives and bullets. But her hands, the same hands that had once trembled while carrying drinks or fending off the clumsy advances of strangers, were steady now. They moved with a purpose she didn't know she possessed. She pressed cloth to his side to stanch the bleeding. She wiped the blood and grime from his jaw. She used a needle and thread from her mending kit to stitch together the skin that had been split wide open. Through it all, Boone's eyes never left her face. They were dark and unflinching, even as waves of pain threatened to drag him under into unconsciousness. He just watched her, his gaze filled with a raw, unspoken emotion that made her own throat tighten. When the worst of it was over, when the bleeding had slowed to a stubborn ooze and her makeshift bandages were soaked red, his voice broke the silence. It wasn't the growl of the fighter she had just seen downstairs. It was something quieter, something reverent. It carried a weight she had never heard in any man's voice before. "Beg me to stop loving you," he whispered, his breath warm and ragged against her ear. "And I won't." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. They rooted her to the spot where she knelt beside his bed. She looked at him. This man of violence and exile, this soul stitched together with scars and sins, and she finally understood the truth that had been circling her all along. Boone McGraw wasn't just running from the death that dogged his trail. He was running toward something. Every dusty mile, every bloody gunfight, every sin he had committed. It had all been leading him here, to this room, to this bed, to her hands, steadying him against the encroaching dark. Tears blurred her vision, hot and sudden, but her voice was strong and clear when it came. "Then don't stop," she said, her own voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the battered, stubborn rhythm of his heart beneath her hand. Not ever. And in that fragile room, floating above the ruined saloon, with the smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes and blood binding them together in a way no promise ever could, Clara realized a startling truth. She wasn't just tending to a dying man. She was binding her own soul to the only man who had ever, in her entire life, truly seen her. Dawn crept over Red Horse Crossing like the blade of a cold steel knife, slicing the night in two. The town was bruised and battered, its windows like vacant eyes, its soul soured by the gunfire and broken glass. It woke with its jaw set hard against Boone McGraw and the saloon girl who had chosen to stand beside him. The whispers from the day before had turned into angry curses. The curses were hardening into outright threats. Sheriff Dooling's voice could be heard carrying through the streets, steady as a death nail being hammered into a coffin lid. He was promising justice and order, but everyone in town knew it was blood he was really after. Upstairs in her small room, Clara pressed her face against the cool window pane. She could see shadows moving below, men gathering in small groups, their shapes like hunters preparing for a kill. Downstairs, the piano sat silent, its keys covered in a fine layer of dust and splinters from the fight. That same piano had been the soundtrack to her prison. For the first time, she felt no regret at the thought of leaving it behind. The whiskey, the cards, the fake smiles and songs sung to strangers, all of it had been the bars of her cage. Now those bars were breaking, but escape meant riding out into a wilderness that was every bit as merciless as the men who were hunting them. Boone stood behind her, his hat brim pulled low, a saddlebag slung over his good shoulder. The blood had dried on his shirt where her stitches held his skin together, but his eyes burned with a clear, determined light. "It's now or never, Clara," he said. His voice was quiet, but it held the certainty of the rising sun. She turned from the window, saw the unshakable truth in his eyes, and slipped her hand into his without a single moment of hesitation. They moved like ghosts, slipping out the back, their boots whispering over the frost-crusted earth. Every step carried them farther away from the gallows that the town had already built for them in its mind. 2 horses were waiting in the deep shadows of the livery, their breath steaming in the frigid morning air. Clara mounted Samuel, the old gray gelding she'd sometimes groomed on restless nights, finding a strange comfort in the simple task. Boone swung up onto his black mare with the fluid ease of a man who was more at home in a saddle than anywhere else on earth. The first sliver of light broke over the horizon as they rode, painting the endless prairie in pale, fragile gold. The land stretched out before them, rolling in vast waves of dry grass and dust, a landscape wide enough to swallow them whole and never give them back. Clara's heart was pounding in her chest, but it wasn't with fear anymore. It was with something wilder, something untamed. It felt like freedom, but it was tangled up with damnation, as if the two had always been 2 sides of the same coin. Behind them, they could hear the first shouts as the sheriff's posse fanned out through the streets, realizing their prey had flown. Ahead of them, there was nothing but the brutal, beautiful expanse of sky and earth, a world that promised everything and nothing all at once. Boone glanced over at her. His jaw was set in a hard line, but when his eyes met hers, they softened for just a fraction of a second. And Clara knew. She knew that whatever the world had waiting for them out here, more blood, a lifetime of exile, or a quick and violent ruin, they would face it together. They were no longer bound by scarlet velvet or unspoken debts. They were bound by a choice, the choice to ride headlong into the unknown, side by side. The sun was a fiery wound, bleeding out across the western horizon when they finally reached the ridgeline. It painted the sky in streaks of fire and ash, turning the prairie below into a place of long, merciless shadows. Golden light clung to the tips of the tall grass like a last, desperate prayer. Boone reined in his horse, the mare blowing hard, and swung down from the saddle. His boots crunched against the loose rock. Clara followed, her skirts catching on the wind, her own breath coming quick and thin from the climb. For a long moment, they just stood there together, side by side, looking out over the vast, empty land. The silence between them was bigger than the sky, louder than any gunshot, heavier than any oath ever sworn. Finally, Boone turned to face her. The lines on his face were etched deep by the sun and by a sorrow that seemed as old as the hills around them. He reached for her hand. His palm was rough, scarred from ropes and reins and triggers, but it was warm and steady as the earth beneath their feet. He took her trembling fingers and pressed them against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel it beating, a slow, stubborn rhythm that refused to quit. "Clara," he said, his voice low and raspy, carrying the weight of every dusty mile he had ever ridden and every man he had ever left in his wake. "I ain't ever gonna outrun what I've done. The past, it don't let go that easy. I ain't fool enough to pretend it will." He paused, and his breath hitched for just a second, a flicker of something raw and uncharacteristically fragile crossing his eyes. "But with you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "with you, I think I can finally turn around and face it." The words struck her deeper than any bullet ever could. For so long she had been the shaking saloon girl, the girl in the scarlet dress, painted up to look fierce while she was hiding all her broken pieces in the shadows. But now, standing here, beneath the fiery burn of the setting sun, she felt something inside her shift, something profound and permanent. She was no longer hiding. He saw her. He saw all of her, the broken parts and the strong parts, and somehow, that made her whole. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "Then we'll face it together," she whispered, and the tremor in her voice wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the sheer, terrifying enormity of the promise she was making. "I choose you, Boone McGraw. The outlaw, the killer, the man, the storm you carry inside you. I choose all of it." The breath left him in a sudden, sharp rush, as if she'd punched him in the gut. He bent to her, cupping her face in his scarred hands as if she were something precious, something that might break. Their lips met, soft at first, a hesitant question. Then it became something fierce, something hungry. It was a vow written not in ink on paper, but in flesh and fire and dust. It was as fragile as smoke and as strong as forged iron, binding them together tighter than any chain ever could. The sun dipped lower, and the long shadows rose up to claim the land. But on that lonely ridgeline, they stood together, two broken figures against a dying sky, no longer running, unbroken. Whatever the world had waiting for them down in the darkness, blood, or exile, or ruin, they would meet it. Not as a fugitive and a saloon girl, but as two souls bound by a promise, forged in desperation, and sealed in the fading light. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen right now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. And don't forget to subscribe and maybe even consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories just like these. Your support means everything. Thank you.